Talk about what these so-called veteran WoW players are calling the hardest dungeon ever to be conceived by Blizzard. Old Naxxramas. Naxxramas has long been considered to be the hardest dungeon, and for a good reason. It wore on the whole guild, and while Blackwing Lair and Anki-Raj were tough as hell, Naxxramas was unforgivable. Before I start explaining how hard it was and my personal experiences in Naxx, allow me to share some numbers with you. Before the Burning Crusade, there were around 895,000 level 60 characters scattered across 179 US servers. There were only 900 guilds that managed to kill only one boss in Naxxramas, and take a guess at how many guilds actually cleared Naxxramas on US servers. Nope, you're wrong. 23. That's right. 23 guilds managed to clear the entire raid. That means that an average of around 1,000 players got to kill Kel'Thuzad, which is less than 0.1% of the entire US player base. 0.1%. That is a number that has never been achieved with any other dungeon in the history of WoW. Hell, no other dungeon even came close to that number. So why were there so few guilds and players that cleared the entirety of Naxxramas? Well, let's start off with what you actually needed to be able to step into Naxxramas, shall we? First of all, the absolute minimum requirement in terms of gear was a majority of tier 2 or tier 2.5 gear, and nothing lower than items that were on par with tier 1. If you didn't have that kind of gear, it was back to farming Blackwing Lair or AQ40. So even before you were geared for Naxx, you had to run Molten Core to get tier 1, and then Blackwing Lair and AQ4 to get your hands on the tier 2 and tier 2.5. And keep in mind that all these raids I just mentioned were 40-man raids, and every boss dropped an average of 3 epics. 4 or 5 if you were lucky, but definitely 3 on average. Those 3 items on average had to be split over a 40-man raid group. And don't forget that not every raid had the exact same people. So there were a total of around 60 to 70 people in that guild that needed to be geared up in order to enter Naxxramas. Okay, so after months and months of farming Blackwing Lair, Onyxia, AQ40 and such, you finally had 40 people that were geared for Naxx. Does that mean you're ready for this instance? Nope, of course not. Because not only did you need some of the best items in game to start raiding there, you also needed a ton of consumables. That's right, the encounters in Naxx 40 were actually so hard that the best possible gear you could get before Naxx 40 was not good enough for Naxx 40. If Blizzard did that now in Mist of Pandaria, there would be an outrage on the forums of people screaming in terror to buff the items, but in WoW Vanilla, that was it. You had the tier 2 and tier 2.5 and that was it. There was nothing better before Naxx 40. Most guilds attempted Naxx 40 on weekends, so during the weekdays you were forced to farm consumables such as potions, food, flasks and other stuff. And this was one of the things that really wore on me as a healer. If you were a healer and you had to farm consumables, you were screwed because you did next to no damage to mobs. There was no spell power back then. Oh no, tier 2 and tier 1 only gave you bonus healing, which meant your offensive spells did no extra damage whatsoever. So farming was extremely slow and extremely painful. Not only that, there was no dual talent option where you could simply switch from Resto to Feral, and even if you could, you probably didn't even have the proper gear for that spec because all the items that had agility and strength went to warriors and rogues who needed it for their main spec. Even if you somehow got your hands on some decent Feral gear, a respec cost a total of 60 gold every time. That's right, if you were to farm with your off spec, you basically had to spend 60 gold to switch to that spec, and another 60 gold to eventually switch to your raiding spec. That's a total of 120 gold, which was a lot of money back in those days. a lot of money. Alright, now we got 40 people who are geared and have a crap load of consumables. Are we ready to enter the instance now? Nope. The final step to actually getting into the instance was the attunement quest, which was a bitch on its own. First of all, you had to get honored with the Argent Dawn, which meant you had to either farm quests and mobs, or run dungeons such as Schoolman's. Now imagine if you've just done Blackwing Lair, you got a bunch of tier 1, you got a bit of tier 2 gear, and all of a sudden you have to jump into level 60 blue 5-man dungeons just to get honored. That was extremely annoying because obviously you're not getting anything out of those dungeons apart from the reputation. I mean, the items you get there are pretty useless unless for some kind of decent off-spec items. Maybe, but that was really frustrating. And after you get honored, you still had to throw down 5 arcane crystals, 1 righteous orb, and 2 nexus crystals. Those regions used to cost an approximate of at least 200 gold. If you were revered, it only cost 90 gold, and if you were exalted, the quest was completely free. But getting exalted was extremely time consuming, so you were better off just coughing up the items to get your pass for Nax 40. Okay, so now we can finally enter the hardest instance in the entire game. So I guess that now it's time to talk about the difficulty of the actual bosses. Now there might be people here watching this video saying, well, I've cleared Naxxramas Lich King and that was pretty hard. Well, maybe, but it was nothing compared to Nax in WoW Vanilla. Let me give you an example, such as the Locust Swarm of Anoop Rikan. The effect of Locust Swarm in Wrath caused a dot debuff that did around 1300 to 1700 nature damage every 2 seconds, and it silenced the target. The effect of Locust Swarm in Vanilla caused a dot debuff that did around 1200 damage every 2 seconds, and it silenced the target. That's right. Even though an average geared player in Wrath had at least 10 times more health, the damage of the debuff was almost exactly the same as in Vanilla. Back then, a proper geared Clothy had about 3500 health at best, which meant 3 ticks of that debuff and you were dead. 6 seconds and you were dead. You were done. Another boss that comes to mind is Noth. Raids in Wrath could actually ignore the curse and didn't even bother to decurse. However, if there was no decursing going on in Nax Vanilla, it meant an instant wipe for the entire raid. That's how hard it was. Hell, even the 4 horsemen fight, you needed 8 geared tanks. 8! Not 1, not 2, not 1 main tank, 2 off tanks. No, 8 geared tanks. That's absolutely insane compared to today's standards. I remember in my guild, we actually had to try and steal geared tanks from other guilds to help us out because A, we didn't have enough attuned tanks, and B, they weren't all properly geared. That's how far we had to go to even stand a chance against an encounter that wasn't even one of the last bosses in Nax 40. That's right, it was that freaking brutal. Nax 40 had almost the exact same damage values as Nax in Wrath Lich King, which makes Nax in Wrath look hilariously easy. Just for a comparison, Nax in Wrath was fully cleared in less than a week after its launch. Let's take a look at Nax in Vanilla. The patch for Naxxramas came out on the 19th of June 2006, and it wasn't until the 7th of September before Kel'Thuzad was finally killed. That's right, it took the entire player base almost 3 months before one guild actually managed to clear the entire instance. That is something that is just extreme if you compare that to other instances. I mean, instances in Burning Crusade came kind of close, but this is a number that has been unmatched for years. It was 2006, it's 2014 right now. It's been 8 years and there hasn't been an instance that came even close to this number. That is absolutely insane. Not only that, in order to actually survive insane damage like this, you needed resistance gear. Something that has become obsolete in today's WoW. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if people don't even know what resistance gear is for anymore. I wouldn't be surprised. But you actually need to get your hands on frost resistance, nature resistance, shadow resistance, and fire resistance gear in order to properly withstand all the damage in this instance. And resistance gear, especially for frost, was extremely scarce. There were a few frost items that dropped from bosses in Naxx 40, but once again, every single guy in that 40-man group needed to have that gear, so it could take another month before you actually had some frost resistance gear, which you absolutely needed for the fight against Sephiron. And it wasn't like you could just go to the auction house and buy a green level 55 of the frost resistance gear. No, that was not enough. You actually needed purpose-built frost resistance gear. Frost resistance gear with spell damage. Frost resistance gear with increased defense and a lot of stamina. And that took a long time. If your raid didn't have any frost resist gear, you could not do Sephiron. If you couldn't do Sephiron, you couldn't move on to Kel'Thuzad. So basically, if your guild didn't have any frost resistance, you were stuck at Sephiron. That's it. That's the farthest you will come. If your raid didn't have any shadow or nature resistance gear, it was an absolute bitch to get through the beginning parts of the Plague, Spider, and Abomination Wing, let alone Loathep. You needed resistance gear. Alright, let's recap a bit before we move on. So let's just check out what aspects we have that make Naxx 40 really hard so far. So far we have the gear in terms of farming tier 1, then tier 2, and tier 2.5. And then we have dealing with scarce loot while rolling against 39 other people in your raid. We have consumables which cost a crap load of money or took ages to farm if you didn't have a DPS character. We have that freaking attunement quest, which also costed a crap load of money. The insane damage values. And finally the mandatory resistance gear. So now let's move on to trash. As I just stated above, you needed resistance gear to clear out trash in several wings. But not only that, some trash actually respawned after 30 minutes. That's right, you had 30 minutes to try and kill a boss until you were stuck at the start, having to kill all that trash over and over and over, which can really wear on you if you keep wiping on one boss and not making any progression whatsoever, which brings me to something else I want to bring up. The drama. Naxx 40 was brutal and it wore out guilds one by one. It was basically farming consumables during the weekdays, which cost a lot of time, and then wiping over and over again during the weekends, only to get stuck on trash after 30 minutes and having to start all over again. It was only a matter of time before people in guilds started getting frustrated and started pointing fingers, blaming other people, etc. Many vanilla players have said that Naxx 40 was the guild breaker, and I quote, "If you wanted to tear your guild apart, you should do Naxx 40. I guess now is a good time to tell you about my personal experience in Naxx 40. I was in one of the top raiding guilds on the Frostmane server called Legio Excisio. We were one of the first guilds to kill Nefarian, and in AQ 40 we got to Cthulhu before Naxx 40 came out. We had a great time in Molten Core, Blackman Lair, Onyxia, but when we started doing Naxx 40 we watched our own guild crumple apart. We got sick and tired of spending hours and hours farming consumables only to waste them on countless wipes, which meant fights in Vedrillo started happening, people not wanting to do Naxxramas anymore, which led into us not getting any further. And that eventually led into our guild eventually breaking up. We managed to kill Instructor Vesuvius, Anubrakan and Patchwork, but after that we pretty much reached a dead end. We were tired of wiping, fiping, pointing fingers, we just gave up. We left the guild and we went our own way, and that was pretty much the end of our guild. Despite all the great times we had in Blackman Lair and Molten Core and the fun, Naxx 40 just destroyed our guild. I know it sounds dramatic, but it really happened that way. And trust me, it happened for so many guilds. And so many people will tell the exact same story I'm telling now. It destroyed guilds because it wore on you so bad. It was as I've said before, brutal. Not only that, imagine the lag and the horrible frame rate players had to deal with. Imagine trying to do a raid with 39 other people throwing around spells and killing tons of mobs. I mean, my computer back then was considered to be a pretty decent gaming computer, and even that thing struggled to get more than 25 frames per second. Compare that with WoW today, where even the most basic gaming PC will have no trouble running WoW at 60 frames per second on medium settings. It was... That just made it extra difficult, not being able to respond just like that. You basically were just always half a second behind because your frame rate was terrible, and then there was the lag. Hell, some people actually disconnected from the server during fights, such as Thaddeus. I mean, that is just insane. It would be unacceptable in today's WoW, and it happened in vanilla, in Naxx40. I've heard people say that Naxx40 can't be hard because the mechanics are a lot easier than today's mechanics from bosses. And yes, you are absolutely right. I mean, the mechanics for Garrosh on Heroic are a lot more complicated and a lot more advanced compared to bosses in WoW Vanilla. But keep in mind that back then we also didn't have nowhere near enough flexibility in terms of spells and longevity. Almost every single spell was mana expensive. I mean, you had healers going out of mana, tanks lacking rage and almost no AoE aggro abilities, and hunters also going out of mana. Yeah, you heard me right. Hunters had mana back in those days and needed to carry around mana potions if they were to last during a long fight. Getting out of mana was no exception. It happened every time, and especially in Naxxramas, you needed to have consumables just to be able to survive, just to have enough mana, just to continue on healing or throwing frostbolts or whatever. You needed it. Well, I guess that's everything I can tell you about Naxx40 for now. I hope you realize how brutal this instance was back then, and I'm pretty sure there are a few more arguments to explain how to convince people how hard Naxx40 was back in WoW Vanilla. Despite that, I still had some glorious times in Naxxramas, and I can't deny I feel somewhat proud to be part of that, that handful of guilds who actually managed to kill some bosses in that godforsaken place. Yeah, that was just, lots of memories there, but not all of them were really great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to know your experience in Naxx40, so if you want to share that, then leave a comment below this video. Okay folks, that's pretty much it. I'm Hamster Gaming, and have a good one. Bye bye.